Welcome again to Borderless Live. Today we're going to have a wonderful conversation with Juan Aguiriano, who is Group Head of Sustainability and Technology Ventures at the Kerry Group, and Defne Saral, who is joining us as Global Sales Director Ingredients at FrieslandCampina. As everybody in the food sector and all of us who are related to it have noticed, the pandemic has certainly accelerated the changes across the food value chain. So what are the consequences for the sector? What are we going to do about that? What are we going to do with this acceleration? And this is what Juan and Defne will handle for us this afternoon. So without further ado, let me hand over to Defne, who's going to introduce herself to everybody. Go ahead, please, Defne.
Hi, good afternoon, Andrew and everyone. My name is Defne Saral. As you already mentioned, I'm the head of sales for the Ingredients business group of FrieslandCampina, which is a farmer-owned cooperative based in the Netherlands, about 150 years old. And prior to that, I was with the Dupont company for about 15 years. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Defne. And Juan, please.
Hello, Andrew. Hello, Defne. How are you? Good to see you both. I'm with the Kerry Group. I'm the head for the group for sustainability. I've been in the role for the last 2 years. Previously to that, I had commercial responsibilities in Europe for the group. And previous to that, I was with the Dupont corporations. So Kerry is one of the leading companies in the taste and nutrition space. 7 billion, 26,000 employees. A very global company.
Indeed, both well-known companies and well-known to most of the people actually who are going to be on this conversation today. So without further ado, let me just take you, Defne, let's start with you. We were talking during our research phase about consumer trends. Maybe give us an example of what trends have been accelerated, particularly through the last months with what's been going on with this pandemic.
Well, Andrew, a few things. I think it's clear that people have been eating at home more often, and so people are looking to give themselves little indulgences, things that they enjoy making and eating, but they're also looking at the health benefits of them. So for the first time, it's starting to be normal to look at indulgence foods as well as foods that would provide you some sort of nourishment. And to give you a fun example, something like probiotic foam on ice cream, right? That would have been unheard of, uniting those two together.
Probiotic foam on ice cream.
Right.
Okay.
So I think the other thing that people have become very concerned with is not wasting food, right? So with purchase coming into the home, people don't want to be discarding leftovers. They're embracing a no-waste culture. So using remaining ingredients. I know myself, I've made banana bread multiple times being at home. And so that's one other element. And then finally, good taste. So
all of these kind of demand you're saying is increasing in this respect. From consumers. What about you? I think you've got food safety at the top of your agenda, Juan.
Well, I think from a consumer trend, I agree with Defne that a number of underlying trends have been that were already present have been accelerated by COVID, and then you see some new emerging trends. So if I give you some examples, food safety and trust is one key trend that is really being accelerated. 3/4 of consumers want to know more about safety. What is in my plate? Is it safe to eat? For how long? The implications is food protection, food preservation, shelf life, safe packaging are all things which are becoming more important as you try to maximize food safety and then minimize food waste, as Defne mentioned, which has increased a lot during the COVID. We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
People want to recognize the ingredients. They need to be natural, clean label. That's something that already was there, but it's evolving. Right? So a lot of alternative or new food trends accelerating. Plant protein was already there, but the COVID is accelerating that. Healthier alternative, more environmentally friendly alternatives. Staying well, I agree with Defne on the health drive. Looking for functional ingredients that help boost immunity, for instance. So you have things like beta-glucans or probiotics that Defne mentioned. We also have botanicals with healthy halo, not always totally proven clinically health benefits, but the consumer is used to these traditional names, looking at that in a modern, improved type of solutions for the food they eat every day. So food is health, improving the diets, trying to balance less activity, staying more at home with better diets is a trend, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting to see that the industry is following suit in the context of a European Green Deal. Nutri-Score is being adopted by many countries. So the information on the pack is becoming very important. Also interesting to hear some of the announcements, for instance, and don't want to jump the gun yet, but Unilever announced last week that they will put a carbon label on 70,000, basically their whole portfolio by 2039. That's a milestone announcement. So you don't only have price and nutritional information on the pack anymore, you will have environmental information, starting with carbon.
And that's going to be, I mean, when something's on the pack, Juan, that's carbon all the way through the whole chain, from a grower all the way through to the package, right? So it's not
That's
just
right.
what Unilever does.
Right. It's in sourcing, in the farm, it's in production, on how you produce the ingredient, and potentially also how you use it in use.
Yeah. Well, I think all of us during this period have been acutely aware that there's a chance that we're doing less when we're in our home offices for the majority of the time, and that clearly eating better and maybe eating differently to avoid the overweight syndromes and so on, which, by the way, are also a threat when it comes to infection. That clearly has been an important trend for us. And would you say that's been one of the areas that has accelerated through this period? Definitely, you had a perspective on this from a green electricity and energy perspective, I think.
Yeah, I think, Andrew, what you're referring to is immunity, right? And what are consumer needs in that space? And I'm sure Juan can talk to that as in depth as well. I think what you're asking is also in industry. What are the areas that are looking at in more production, right? And so, Juan mentioned carbon. Circular economy is really the one that's on the lips of people as well. Yeah. How do we design? How do we make things? How do we keep within the planetary boundaries? So when you say green electricity, there's a lot of companies going, okay, the things that we control in our own food manufacturing, how can we make the electricity we use be green? There's a lot of different schemes and mechanisms, right? But you see the food industry saying we have an obligation to go as far green as we can. So the firm that I work for has been 100% green electricity in the Netherlands and is 94% green electricity worldwide, and is proud of that. And I think you see much more companies doing the same, whether it's in the brewing sector, so I'm in dairy, but across the food sector, people saying, well, how can we greenify whatever energy we're using to produce our foods? The next step is then the recycling phase.
So the next step is what? Sorry, I missed what you said.
The next step would then be the recycling phase, right? The end of use and end of life. How do you bring it full loop?
Well, and that, of course, applying to food, but also applying to areas like packaging and so on, which have been a part of our earlier conversations, or the whole plastics industry and the packaging industry needs to do on that subject. And that's a whole other story that we're going to cover in September. But clearly, people who are directly involved in food packaging having to take big steps there, aren't they? You were going to say something, I think, about innovation when it relates to this acceleration, Juan. Something you've been talking about for a little while.
Yeah, the innovation is something that today is taking a number of forms. So putting environmental and sustainability inside the product is something that Defne started to refer to. Very large, probably largest beer company in the world has launched its largest beers in the US, its largest beer brand in the US, China, and Europe, with a logo on the can that says brewed with 100% renewable electricity. Right? So when you see a mega brand like that, having a move like this, started in 2019 in the US and then expanding to Europe and China, it tells you where the innovation is coming from. So the industry is producing a renewable electricity, but the consumer is buying the more sustainable product, right? So that's one example, but you have many trends like that where You drive that through vegan burgers, non-alcoholic beer, immunity food, protein bars, cold brew coffee made of coffee waste. So the cold brew extracts are made of coffee waste. So closing the loop and making sure that the product you get gives you more nutrition, but with less impact. So sustainable nutrition is a trend that is accelerating very quickly. So the basic foundation is safety. Is it safe? Is it trustful? The second one is, okay, is it good for me from a nutrition point of view? And the third one, is it good for the planet? Or for my family, my community, and then the planet, right? Depends on the ambition of the consumer. Does he want to save himself, his family, or the planet, right? Different people have different scopes.
All three at some point, right?
Ideally, all three, exactly.
Yeah, and huge pressures come on the industry as a consequence of that. I mean, some of the things that we've talked about, Defne, which are clearly integral to this, are things like traceability, for example, responsible sourcing. Do you have a perspective for us on that, Defne?
Well, you know, in the beginning, responsible sourcing was something that was for niche brands, right? People who were interested in knowing exactly which farmer, you know, which practice, what kind of water usage is going on, but it's now becoming mainstream, right? And so we in the food industry are being tasked more and more to be able to do, you know, farm to fork kinds of traceability. People want to know very specifically, you know, how was, you know, the soil treated, how were the animals cared for, what are those best practices and standards, and people are looking for net zero, right, in the future value chains. So that's really important today. And setting up those traceability programs is really critical.
Yeah. I can just imagine that every pack that I buy, for example, from somewhere along the dairy chain, the individuals packing that will be putting maybe a code specific to that individual pack rather than gross batches as we're seeing today. I can see that occurring. It's a huge issue for packagers and other people, of course.
A couple of years ago, those things were theory, right? And today they're actually happening. Right? There are examples of on package, you know, QR code where you can plug in and you can actually see which farm did that come from, you know, what area, what region, and consumers want to be informed. I think with smartphones, it's pretty easy to be able to click and see and get a wealth of information that just wasn't available before. So Indeed. We're talking realm of reality.
You were going to say something, Juan. Thank you, Defne.
No, I wanted just to complement some research we've done that complements what Defne just highlighted, right? It's not niche anymore. It's 50% of consumers looking to more responsible foods and consume responsibly. So foods that are produced with less carbon, energy, water, waste, but also the traceability. Where does it come from? Does it respect animal rights? Does it respect biodiversity? Not too much deforestation? Is it really produced responsibly? And the other issue that's come up, is accelerated, is 1/3 of food is wasted every day from farm to consumer. But consumers have noticed that they're wasting more food during the lockdown. You buy more, you stockpile, you go less to the restaurants, so food service has to have basically shut down the restaurants and food service, and they had to write off, unfortunately, a lot of the inventories in finished or in preparation. So there's a whole spike of food waste that's happened in the last 4 or 5 months, and the end is not yet in view, right? As we look at the North American and South American continent.
Regrettably.
So the whole area of the conundrum of maximizing food safety, maximizing shelf life as food needs to last longer, minimizing packaging, and we see a spike now in single-use packaging again, while people were trying to diminish it, and companies were trying to diminish it, and countries were trying to diminish it for the last year. We're seeing a spike again in single-use packaging. And then last but not least, how do all of these influences the total food waste? So that equation is quite complex and has consumer behaviors implications, industry implications, farm implications, depending if you're in developed worlds or developing world.
Really tough. You brought in the subject of food service. I mean, this area must have been tremendously badly hit, definitely in the last months, given with all the shutdowns these places have had. They've had to really change what they do, I suspect.
The height of the crisis, it was close to 40% in some areas, and in areas that were a little bit more lucky, maybe as low as minus 20%. But it's clear, food service was massively impacted as everybody closed. HoReCa, cafes, restaurants, and that was a big reversal of the trend. Right? In the United States, it's back already 2 years ago. We started to see that the average consumer's food spend, right, had gone from 50% of it or more was actually being spent out of home. So people were doing convenience foods on the go, buying outside, rather than going to a retailer and taking the food home and shopping, eating at home. And that completely changed in Corona. And so the question is, will that remain? Or will it go back to where we see that food service natural out-of-home shift? But it's true that we've had massive impact, whereas the retailers like Walmart, Ahold, others have been doing very well during this crisis. So
indeed, the retailers have done reasonably well and put a lot of pressure back into the system, of course, onto their suppliers as a consequence. You were talking earlier on, Defne, about food waste as well. I mean, there are some obvious things that people can do in their home lives. What's the industry doing, and what are you doing in terms of your company, in terms of driving this prevention of waste and reduction in waste? What's happening in that area?
I think, firstly, the food industry first focused on nutrition, right, and malnourishment and famine. And again, a few years ago, we passed the point where we say, well, actually, we're making enough food to feed everybody in the world. In fact, we're making a lot of food. The problem now is access to it and availability. So one of the examples is we say, okay, if there's about 5,000 calories per day that are produced per person that's alive, only 2,000 of it is available for consumption, because we're still losing a lot in harvest losses and destruction in households. But then when we finally get to the household, there's also an enormous amount of food waste. I think Juan has mentioned previously, there's in different countries, like in the UK, they say 1/3 of all food purchased goes to food waste. And so the industry is shifting towards, what are the solutions that we can come up with in this space? And at the same time, the population is still growing. So by 2050, we're still going to have to produce 50-60% more food. So it's this big equation that we talk about from farm to fork, and we say, okay, what are the benefits? And a lot of that is creating alliances and working together, right? And saying from start to finish, where do we need to get food to for people? And then what is the quality of that calorie that they need?
Well, that's interesting. But that, of course, the packaging industry has some of the share in all of this in terms of making sure product gets to market in a good condition and in good shape. But maybe a good idea, we're talking about food waste. What do we actually mean by that? Juan, do you have a definition for us?
Yeah, so some numbers for context and then a definition, right? About 33% of the food produced globally is about 1.3 billion tons. Okay, difficult to imagine what that is. So it's 185 kilos on a per inhabitant basis per year. So half a kilo every single day is lost per person. That doesn't mean the person loses it, but from the farm to the fork, that's what is lost every day. It's also close to 1 trillion euro, right? And the COVID, that's on average historically. The COVID has only accelerated that. Due to the issues we talked about, food service and then stockpiling, etc. Right? So how do you define that? Food loss is what occurs along the food supply chain, from harvest up to, but not including the retail level. Food waste occurs at the retail and consumption level. Mm-hmm. Now, there is no real easy solution to attack this as a single company. This needs really to be tackled as a systemic approach, end to end. And also the problem is not the same everywhere. For instance, North America and Oceania, Australia are the top of the charts in these ranking, unfortunately, 40% of food wasted or lost there. More developed countries, Africa or India, are closer to 20%. The problem is not the same. The food waste occurs at retail and consumption in the US, mostly in the US and Australia. It happens upstream in the value chain in India and Africa. Sometimes the cold chain is broken and the food literally spoils on the road.
Oh, yeah. Very different.
So the benefits of reducing is massive, as we saw from the economic value of it, but also the environmental value, because the amount of land, water, energy, resources that is embedded into every kilo we throw away is massive. So food waste is indirectly probably one of the biggest levers that the food industry has to meet and to help the planet on climate change, water, biodiversity loss, etc. Right?
It's certainly a complex equation. I was just looking at some of the early discussions we had, Defne. You know, there are clearly major impacts on environmental benefits if we can reduce waste along the early parts of the in the food chain generally. Is this something which you're engaged on in some way?
Yeah, one of the things we look at is, okay, so food waste, generally, if we were to be able to cut it in half, which is one of the goals, if you look at planetary boundaries, how much we're producing, what we're losing, kind of food that would be recovered would be vegetables, dairy products, grains, fruits, meat, bakery category. And generally it's the meat category that gets the most attention these days because of meat production and its significant greenhouse gas emissions. So we know that if we are able to reduce loss and waste there, that would have an enormous climate change or sustainability impact. And so it's really looking at category by category and saying, well, how can we eliminate the food waste? What will make that improvement in the global value chain? So that's where I think the focus is, category by category.
Yeah. And is there something specific going on in the segments that you deal with in particular, where there's a good example of things that have been done there?
Well, I think farmer-owned cooperatives for dairy. So one of the things we do is we optimize the kind of feed that the animals are getting, making sure that it's the highest quality. There's a check on the quality of milk, protein, fat, carb content of it. Being able to look and say, okay, well, how's their well-being? How's the water use? What's the soil program? A lot of the farms have energy, biomass, biogas producers. So there's really a lot going on. The Netherlands, where I'm based, generally is incredible when it comes to intensive farming practices. Also greenhouse. So not just the company I work for, but the industry itself. Yes. It's the world's largest tomato exporter in the world. So there's really a lot of intense farming and efficient intense farming that's going on. Yeah,
we're living close to here in Belgium, of course. We come across that pretty frequently. While we're on the subject of Belgium, an interesting question came up here, which is not directly related to dairy, but it does relate to the drinking industry. With less social gathering, of course, there's been a reduction in substantial reduction in drinking beer in particular. Can you innovate your way around that? That's essentially what this question's about. Do you have a view on beer, Juan? How do you innovate around the reduced volumes in this industry?
Well, that's a good question. I was going to talk about the strategies about how to go beyond farming in manufacturing and in consumption, right? Yeah. So let me maybe just talk slightly theory first, and then we'll come to the beer example.
Sure.
The best way is to use what is called the waste hierarchy. So first, the best waste is the one you avoid, right? So do not produce waste in manufacturing. Do not throw it away in retail at end of the day or end of the shelf life, and do not throw it from the fridge at home, right? But then what you can do is then try to reduce it, but then valorize it. Whatever is left, don't throw it away into because most of the time it will go to energy or animal feed at very low value, right? Feed the pigs, literally, is one example. Very efficient, but not very high value. So can you turn food waste back into ingredients that go back into the value chain, right? And so building that circular economy from food waste into upcycling, into food ingredients and food products again, there are a number of examples there. So I give an example on dairy, since we are here with Friesland. You know, Kerry is also a dairy company historically. So whey was a byproduct with very low value historically, and the industry turned that into very high protein through a number of processes that goes into very high value nutritional bars and beverages, etc., for people that have either athletes or people that have a very healthy lifestyle, right? So that's turning a waste into a very high value and reusing what before was thrown away, right, a long time back. Right? Now, I think considering that, there are a number of principles to use that and turn that back into human food. Right? Okay, to the beer, so considering all the side streams and considering what to do with that. Right? So beer, well, one thing that beer as one of the key waste streams of beer is spent grain. Yeah. Once you extract all the good stuff in the processing and the brewing, you're left with a lot of spent grain. Can you do something useful with that? Repurpose that into useful products? Not easy, with possible. A couple of large brands are already working on that. I've launched commercial products, which contains a lot of very healthy nutrients and actives and fiber that you can repurpose into nutritional beverages, breakfasts, etc. Right? Yeah. Other companies have done in the beer space have taken bakery, literally spent bread, and fermented that and turned that into beer. Right? So I think generally the industry is trying to look for ways to always minimize on a per liter of beer using less energy, less water, alternative sources of grain. Doesn't make sense to ship grain from Europe to Nigeria all the way through the world and not use local cereals, right? Yeah. So using very smart technologies, brewing, fermentation, enzymes, a number of other products, you can really optimize the output. Yeah. Now, how to turn already produced beer into something different, yeah, that might be more challenging.
Well, certainly going to be a challenge on the liver one, but it's a wonderful question, but I think all the solutions and ideas that you've just presented, I think going to be wonderful long-term ideas, but I'm not sure they will get overcome the issues related to the current consumption with all the lockdowns.
Well, one last point, Andrew.
Yeah.
The consumption of lower alcohol drinks is increasing.
Yes.
Very exponentially. Not sure it's good news for the beer industry unless you produce, so what is called hard seltzers is a category which is exploding in North America in particular, right?
What is that one?
Hard seltzers, right?
Hard seltzers, okay.
Right. Yeah. So these are typically very low alcohol adult beverages. And they replace wine or beer with a lower content and still some enjoyment. Right?
Yes, and still some enjoyment, assuming you want to have the hard stuff, right? Yeah. Well, let's maybe. I think that beer question was an interesting one, prompted a lot of ideas for us here. But how do you see the kind of solutions we were talking about? How do you see solutions working today or in the future? Definitely, you've talked about upcycling dairy streams in the past. Is there any other area we should be looking at in other sectors?
I think, so we've talked about dairy, we've talked about brewing. There's also some other traditional areas in, fruit and juices, natural flavors. But, let's talk about some new trends that are fast growing. Is Preservatives, particularly chemical preservatives. There's a lot of work going on to replace those or remove those. Looking at antimicrobial activity, antioxidation activity, in food production, cleanliness is really important. So people want to stop that they have any bacterial contamination. So these trends are sort of both on one end, people want clean label, they want less, but they also want their food safety to be preserved. So those are the competing trends that are going on.
And taste, of course, definitely too, huh? And taste and nutritional value, all of those things, right? Consumers want it all.
Well, and that's also another area is that, it used to be that food that was good for you was known not to taste well, right? And so the acceptance of that no longer is there. It was also known that maybe out of home food purchases were usually less nutritious. Now people are looking for nutrition on the go as well and taste on the go. A lot of different flavors are coming in. So those trends, I think they've been there, they continue to accelerate. But there's a lot going on in clean label, ingredients, solutions in that area. And people are looking for functional flavors, people are looking for alternatives, so for sure.
And this, thank you, Defne. It's really, I think we're producing so much food for thought here. I think we're being more than nutritious in your comments, by the way. Juan, I know you have some perspectives on taking a holistic approach to all of this. How do you kind of put that together?
Again, the traditional chemicals that Defne referred to, things like sodium nitrites, or lactates, or diacetates, or sorbates, or calcium propionate, which are used in bakery or meat or dairy, are not easy to replace, right? But they are chemically based, and the consumers want more clean label, natural solutions, right?
Yeah.
So there is no one-to-one replacement for these. You need to build systems of combinations. Defne mentioned some of those, and you have things like vinegar. Sounds traditional. We've had vinegar forever, 2,000 years probably, but vinegar-based solutions in a high-tech context are a base for many solutions. Fermentation, again, a very old technology, which is taking a very bio fermentation and processing, is another one. We create metabolites, right? So that's another one. Not natural functional flavors, again, functional flavors that are from a natural source, right? Protective cultures, right? The old cultures you find in yogurts in other places, but extended into other applications. And then plant extracts.
Well, a typical application would be what one? Extending the yogurt?
Shelf life, well, processed meats, you would want to extend the shelf life and replacing chemicals with a clean labeled solution that extends the shelf life and minimizes the food waste of the meat, right? You have the same, you can do the same replacing calcium propionate or having natural sources of calcium propionate in bakery. Right? Again, it's shelf life. So bakery could be traditional bakery, but it's also fine bakery, donuts, cookies, other types of bakery, right? It's used or not, it depends. You also have dairy solutions, right? These are typically the top three categories. Definitely mentioned juices, other areas where preservation and not having artificial preservation, but natural preservation solutions, extending shelf life and minimizing food waste is becoming very important. That's what's happening now. And then there's another horizon, which is, okay, what else can you do here? That's where other parts of the system come in. You have to consider smart packaging, right? Can you indicate, there's been trials already in the past, smart sensors on the package that tell you if the product is coming to the end of life.
Yeah.
Can you use AI, artificial intelligence at retail, to start optimizing the category management based on historical trends and consumer trends so that the retailers do a better job of managing the category? You have, we talked about blockchain to go all the way back to the farm to quality traceability in the supply chain, but also minimizing the inventories in that. So just in time. And then digital channels for farmers, right? So direct to consumer, using farmers have always sold directly to consumer, but they were limited to a very local area.
Sure.
Today, you can create virtual marketplaces on the net and delivery to you directly of the fresh produce, which might minimize the waste at the farm. We still remember, it's terrible, but we see the mountains and mountains of fruits and vegetables that are literally landfilled every year because of a surplus of production.
Yeah, indeed. I would just we have two questions came up from our audience today, which relate very, very much to what you say. The first, I think, is an entirely political one from an old friend of ours I see who's come online, and he's saying certainly in the UK there's going to be a lot of loss of food loss simply because there aren't enough pickers to come and pick the food. You know, this is being addressed. I mean, we're getting special flights into the UK, I believe, from Central Eastern Europe to bring pickers in to pick the fruits that isn't being picked because of all the EU stuff that's going on and Brexit and so forth. So I think that's a political question. I'm not going to embarrass you to ask you to answer that. There's another really interesting question came up, you know, on this proximity farming, as somebody put it, in terms of reducing greenhouse emissions, and also, you know, how do you educate consumers in terms of consuming local and seasonal products rather than flying in whatever from all over the world? Definitely, I mean, this is reasonably close to your business too, isn't it? How do you get more local consumption into your markets?
And it's something that, you know, country by country, when we look at food security and food supply, things that have been done. So, you know, the company I work for also has farmers and arrangements for buying milk all around the world, even if they're not the owners of this company. And what we did see in COVID, right, is a lot of borders closed. So then each country started looking at its own food supply, right, and food sustainably, and saying, okay, well, where's the security? What are we okay with? What do we need to buy, bring in from the outside? And I think that, you know, really opened the eyes of government to, you know, how much there is on the ground, right, available to feed its own population. There were also all sorts of things, you know, there has been loss of jobs for people in countries because of the pandemic. And so then, you know, what is the availability of affordable food and securing that, you know, and making it available. And it's heartbreaking, you know, as Juan mentioned, to see, you know, food waste, you know, mountains of, you know, whether it was potatoes or milk being thrown away or whatever, knowing that on the other side, there's people who are vulnerable needing it. So programs to put those in place, you know, between the companies and the governments and really securing that chain. I think as we pass through this crisis, then there's more, you know, going back to the older ways of saying, all right, so if we have food waste, you know, what are the 3 different mechanisms we have to upcycle it, as you call it? And some of it is, you know, okay, biogas, you know, can you just generate it for heat or, again, convert it to electricity? And there's a lot of schemes that are coming up, you know, and buy and pull back programs. There's things, you know, again, the animal production industry, so or feed.
And are these feasible to do all of this on an industrial scale rather than on individual units, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, you know, it's not something that you say, oh, is region by region. You can really design systems today with also all the technology that are really more global rings. I mean, we know this from the dairy industry is there's different seasons in different hemispheres. Right? So you actually are able to move product from one region to another to make sure that you have enough throughout the year. So, you know, some of the things we're talking about with seasonality, you can compensate for. Yeah. But there's always trade-offs, right? So.
Well, there you go. You've got to show the carbon footprint on the package if you Unilever 7-8 years from now, right? So all of that thing will just put the pressure on to be smarter about doing these things. Coming back to, we're going to see a lot of food waste in the UK if our questioner is borne out by the inability to pick and to collect food from the fields. I'm going to just come back onto one in terms of really looking at, you know, everything we've talked about. I think are good things that have been on the go for some time. Yes, they've been accelerated by the pandemic, but you know, people are working on these things. Your companies are working on solutions to improve the situation. But are there any other leading edge kind of trends that you can share with us that would be helpful for our audience to hear?
Yeah, I think that we talked about collaborations. These things are difficult to solve for one single company. So under the EU Green Deal, there's going to be a lot of investment going to the circular economy.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of research happening, a lot of public-private partnerships,
Yes.
where multiple companies collaborating. We don't have alone the solution. And the topic we've talked about, as we've seen, is very systemic. It's end-to-end. It requires the inputs of multiple players. My waste is your product. Chemical industry has done that longer than the food industry, but thinking like that is going to require that type of collaboration, right? So things, and I don't want to bother the audience with too many technical issues, or maybe some people would be very interested. We'll see on the questions.
Well, you're going to get questions later on your email, no doubt.
Right. So, but it's really, waste is actually an interesting commodity, but once you get very successful, do you have enough waste? Because very often then comes, okay, I'm producing something interesting from a byproduct or waste stream, but once I start creating a new product from my waste, can I have enough homogeneous waste? Can I have enough high quality waste systematically? So this is not only looking at within your own waste streams in the manufacturing, but also looking at the supply chain of the waste, right?
Indeed.
So if you want, what are things that you can do directly and what are things you can do indirectly from what you buy? How do you qualify that, etc.? What is the needed processing of the waste? You might need to process the waste before you can reuse it. Is it efficient, right? Because if you need to, you take waste, great, but you have to spend a lot of energy or water or whatever to reprocess it, then some or most of the benefit might be lost. How do you stabilize the side streams for shelf life? Because the waste is biological. It might again go through fermentation, through processing, might not be stable for long. So we're going to have to use preservation. When we talked about food, we're going to have to think about preservation of the waste itself. The waste might come with a lot of water. How do you dry it at scale? Okay, so
what's the cost of that, the environmental
cost of that. You might as well have a closed circuit, right? So you might have a renewable energy grid somewhere close to you, windmills, biogas, whatever, which is a closed circuit again, right? Yeah. You need to understand the cost in use of all of this, right? And then so scalability and volume is very important, right? Now, the good thing is that there are good examples of that in other industries. There are good examples of that at the farm level. There are good examples of that at the manufacturing level. There are good examples of that at even reusing food from retail and redistributing it. But I think right now, what we need to do is end up with a strategy that is really going to drive that. So some initiatives are out there. One recently launched is 10-20-30, where everybody that signs up to that is committing to 50% food waste reduction aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. Mm-hmm. What is it called 10-20-30? It's basically top 10 retailers in the UK driving their top 10 suppliers to commit to that, and they drive their own top 30 suppliers. So you can make the mathematics of the pyramid, and if everybody commits in that direction, you can start creating a movement. And it's using the value chain, right? So my waste is your product, and how do we do that, right?
Well, there's a sense of urgency in all of this, but of course, the issues are so complex in getting people at every level of the value chain working together, and essentially also getting competitors to work together to form cooperation is going to be a tough, and I think a longer-term challenge here, isn't it? That's really interesting points you make there, Juan. I think definitely in our research discussions, we also talked about, how do you move beyond current main applications of side streams, for example, Do you have a perspective on that for us?
The question is to Defne? Yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead,
definitely,
Defne.
yeah.
Yes.
You will no doubt have a perspective on that too.
I think, Juan has talked extensively about, food waste and segregation of streams and quality. I think science plays a role in this going forward, and it's different technologies. We've mentioned the word enzymes, other fermentation techniques, and I think those are going to be absolutely critical.
Yeah.
I think one element that I did want to bring up, as we get closer to our time is, those UN Sustainable Development Goals, right, that Juan mentioned.
Yeah.
Every company has signed on to them and is saying, okay, well, this is the area that's important to me. And then there are forums for people to get together and say, okay, how do we collaborate across to make these a reality? And they're quite aggressive goals, right, if we're going to make what we need.
Well, we do see in our executive search business requirements coming from chief sustainability officers, a title you would not have heard a few years back.
And I think the challenge will be also, what acceptance of genetically modified materials is there going to be in the future. So on one hand, we talked about, clean label, we talked about organic, we talk about, trends towards a feeling of more natural and home. And on the other hand, there is this cutting edge technology and use of things to be able to say, well, okay, what can we invent in the future? What is science going to bring us?
Yeah.
And the food industry, I think, is a bit torn. Some of those like vegan burgers that are coming out that taste exactly like meat, those trends. When you look at actually how that is made, the ingredients that are behind it are very, very high tech, and they're very innovative and recent, science. And people don't seem to ask themselves too many questions in those categories, but ask themselves a lot of questions in others. So it's interesting to see that separation. Yeah. I think one trend we need to be talking about is food innovation, like nutraceuticals. Right? That's the word a lot of people are using. Hey, what about my immune system? What about my well-being? What about my stress or anxiety or my sleep? What are things that I can do? What can I eat to actually make myself feel better? So using really food as medicine is really also a trend that's going to accelerate. And I think maybe with the recent pandemic, people's awareness of health, right, and needing to maintain health has just risen to their forefront.
Very much so, yeah. Juan, is something you wanted to add to that from your perspective?
No, the themes are spot on, Defne. I see the immunity is used to be a niche business in food. People would take more dietary supplements than real food. Yeah. And today it's how do you include in the food these functional ingredients, right? So prebiotics and probiotics to drive immunity. Kerry has a business there, and not disclosing too much, saying that we're doing very well in that space. And the point here is that it's mainstreaming very quickly, and a very number one brand of juices in the UK just launched a new range with probiotics in it. Uh-huh. For immunity and health benefits. Again, it's not a mini brand, a small brand, number one juice brand, right? So that is happening as we speak, right? Yeah. So I think that food is health, is people are saying, okay, it's the diet, and some people want the shortcut. It's okay, I will take specialty foods to help me, right?
Yes.
That's one reflection.
Yeah.
I think the other we didn't talk much about, it's the integrated nature of biotech, right? We will see now really waste streams going into integrated factories, which are biological biotechs. And out of that, you put food at the entrance of it, or waste foods, and you then ferment it with enzymes and other things. And at the exit of that, you get taste extracts, fibers, actives, a number of multiple ingredients that come out of that, right? And you run this on renewable electricity and etc. So really, that is disruptive. It's not adjacent. It's not, okay, can I make more sustainable my existing production processes? Is disruptive. Okay, maybe I need to think about this totally different.
Well, so how does a company think constructively, Daphne, about use of insects as ingredients in food, for example, for the protein value. I guess, you know, you can make them much more efficiently and greener than the cattle where your dairy products are coming from. How do you feel about that? How do you deliver really high quality proteins and so on to people? How do you feel about these rather less common ways of doing things? But some parts of the world, of course, already use considerable amounts of insects.
And you bring up sort of the novel foods category, right?
Yeah.
In Europe. So one of the things we realize is protein. The amount of protein that people need to have and how much we're producing is limited. So as we look out to 2050, there's going to be a protein shortage. So there's a lot of companies that look and say, okay, well, where do we have good sources of protein? And you mentioned insects. You know, an ex-colleague of mine is working in crickets, right? That's a Dutch upstart company, and you would say, okay, well, crickets. Well, in some countries, it's a traditional food, right?
Yeah.
But growing it at this level, or ants, or worms, or others like that.
Yes.
There's some companies that are actually also doing Petri dish proteins, right? So that's on the cutting edge. That's around, you know, $500 burgers kind of stories. There's probably some, you know, science that's going to come out of those spaces as well. Right now, the focus is on proteins, but I think as we look, you know, Juan mentioned probiotics, prebiotics as well. There's really a fundamental understanding that, you know, across different kinds of foods, that's what we need to be reviewing and seeing, you know, also the impact. As I said, you know, what does it do to sleep? What does it do to well-being? What does it do to stress? How do you handle it better? A lot of research is going into that. Wageningen is a traditional, let's say, center within the Netherlands where there's a lot of technology, you know, whether it's farming, food. A lot of companies have big centers there, mine included, and you know, great research coming out of that space. So for those listening, I'd say, you know, we sort of want to point them towards places to keep looking for information.
Yes.
Definitely the Wageningen area is one of them.
That's very, very interesting because it's not something that most people consider outside of their own region. What else other people are eating? There's a couple of things which I wanted to maybe close on with both of you guys. You know, things that you want us to remember as we close this session, but in particular, the theme that's been coming through is the need to work collaboratively across the whole value chain. And one of our member of our audience said, you know, yeah, but where do you start? Who's going to be the one that says, okay, I'm not going to collaborate with you? There's some really strong value chain discussions here. Who's going to start first? And you know, what part does consumer pressure take and is forcing us to collaborate? How do you see that? And maybe just leave us with a little bit of hope longer term. Why don't we start with you, Juan, if you wouldn't mind giving us your kind of final thoughts and include your perspectives on this topic.
Okay, so collaborations and maybe a couple of takeaways personally. I think collaboration is easier if you don't do it with your direct competitor first, right? So do it with your customers.
Yeah.
But don't be a supplier, become a partner to co-create value. So I think 4 hands are better than 2. Very often, if you look at the problem holistically, instead of having what I call the ping pong game, or the blind ping pong game, give me something, I'll do something with it, and I might tell you what I'm doing. That's the old style. These type of relationships don't get very far. So what works extremely well is co-creation and partnerships with the end in mind. And every party brings his own specific competencies to that. So in our case, just talk to Kerry for 2 seconds. We moved from being a flavors and ingredients company to become a taste and nutrition company. We focused less on the products. We kept that, don't get me wrong, it's not focused less on the products, but as a taste and nutrition company, you are looking to deliver the benefits to the customers that are in meat or bakery, etc., and help them optimize their own products through your technologies. What you have to do then is learn a lot about what they're doing and their own categories. Thus having application centers, development centers, chefs, baristas. You know, we have a number, and you would be amazed how many we have of those, of chefs and baristas and other specialists in application. The other thing is you have to collaborate externally. I fully agree with Defne, although I won't pronounce the name as well. Wageningen, or in Ireland, there are many institutions there, and I need to raise the Irish flag here. We have fantastic science happening, and you can collaborate through private-public partnership models, which are very good at managing the IP. What you come in is yours, and what you come out is yours. And if there are things that are created in the middle, they are shared. There are protocols there. Yeah. It's happened for a long time in other industries. So these things can be managed relatively well. That's one.
Yeah.
And then maybe on another topic, on a couple of thoughts I wanted to do, which, if you may allow me to change tack, is COVID has been like a time machine. It's a quote I heard somebody said was written in New York Times, and I think it's so true. It's a time machine to the future. We've seen what the future can be if we don't have healthy people and a healthy planet. And so there are a number of reasons why the pandemic happened, and it's created a lot of risk for the health of people due to some of the aspects of the planet not being healthy. So the second image that comes to mind is a cartoon I saw where you saw a small tsunami wave of the COVID, and behind that a huge economic crisis wave, and behind that an even bigger climate change wave or climate crisis wave. The accelerator to the future has made people realize it's here now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's very well put. And so definitely, what about your thoughts? Give us some hope in the next minute or two about where we should be looking.
Yeah, and I think that's always one of those questions, right? Do you look to the future with positivity, or do you look at it with fear? And when it comes to climate change, the discussions in the past have been a lot about fear, right? When it has come to the pandemic that we're facing, it's a lot about fear. And rather, it's better to turn our direction and say, well, what are we learning from this? People say never waste a good crisis, right? To pick up something. There's a lot of benefits that are coming from what's happening. And I think, I would leave you with, scale, right? A lot of these things that we're looking at already exist, but in smaller bits and pieces. Joining up the farmer, the supplier, the manufacturer, the retailer, and the consumer, they're always good examples. It's just how can we scale them to become more meaningful and more impactful.
Yeah.
It was about 10 years ago that a boss of mine gave me a book called The Great Disruption, right? And that was about climate change. And the first third of it really made you depressed. All these bad things that were happening, what we were doing. And the next 2/3 of it was solutions. I just prefer to be part of the solutions team than the other way around. So
it does sound like definitely that both you and Juan are very much part of our future and the solutions for the food industry and how it deals with all of us. But if I may, I'd like to close by saying thank you so much for all of your wisdom and your thinking in this way. And I wish both of you courage in bringing together the various communities to really help us look to a different future in the food value chain. No doubt the stuff that you're working on will take us a long way there. But thanks to both of you, to Juan and Defne for joining us today. I'd like to also say thank you to our audience for being with us today. Thank you for your questions. And of course, just quickly to remind you that the video of this session will be available in 48 hours on borderless.net, borderless-live-catch up. We hope to see you at our upcoming events. We're going to take a short break. We too will do our very best to take a short summer break here. We'll be back with our next session on September the 2nd, and we very much look forward to seeing you. We know it's going to be something that's going to stimulate you, whether you're in the food business or elsewhere, along one of the sectors served by Borderless. We hope to see you there. And meanwhile, thank you all so much for joining us, and wish you a healthy and happy couple of months coming up till we meet again. Take care and see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Defne. Thank you, Andrew. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Andrew. This has been great.